Hi, my name is William Schaeffer, and our book review today is The Gospel of Thomas, The Hidden Sayings of Jesus, translation by Marvin Meyer. This is arguably one of the most fascinating books in the world. And now a little sketch of the history. In 1945, in Egypt, a fellow by the name of Muhammad Ali found a clay jar with a number of codices in it, old texts. These were probably buried in the desert around 300 to 400 AD, shortly after the Council of Nicaea. And they contain copies of early Christian literature which had been lost for 1800 years. Included in this set of manuscripts was an almost perfect copy of the book called The Gospel of Thomas, attributed to Didymous Thomas, Jesus' twin brother. The book itself consists of 114 sayings, which are said to be transcriptions of the words that Jesus said. In this manner, it's similar to the Quran, which is just a collection of sayings. Now, in 1945, in the Mideast, they also found the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that was a big year for history. The Gospel of Thomas is fascinating because it is very controversial. It is just a collection of sayings. About a third of the sayings are very similar or identical to parables in the New Testament, in the four Gospels in the New Testament. And about a third of them are almost indecipherable. They talk in a strange picture language or allegory that it's not clear what is being said at all. Now, the Gospel of Thomas is not included in the Christian canon. And right off the bat, you can see why. Because it's attributed to Didymous Thomas, who's Jesus' twin brother. Could you imagine a nativity scene with two babies in the manger and only one of them is Jesus? Very interesting. Now, the interesting thing is, what is the authority of this book? How close to historical is this book? And I'll leave that for you. But there are several interesting things. Scholars, long before 1945, had realized that the authors of the Gospels in the New Testament used a common source for sayings. Matthew and Luke both used the same common source for their sayings. 20 years ago, it was speculated that the Gospel of Thomas was that common source, which previously was called the Q source. Today, many people ascribe the date of Gospel of Thomas to the 2nd century AD. So let's look at the timeline and see about the significant events that occurred. The calendar is dated from 0 AD. And that is a significant date on the Jewish calendar, as we'll find out later. It's also customarily the date ascribed to the birth of Jesus. So we'll say he was born in 0 AD. Now, he probably began his ministry about 20 years old, and he was crucified by the time he was 30 AD. Now, James the Just is mentioned a lot in the Gospel of Thomas, and not very much in the Synoptic Gospels. He was martyred 40 years later. Now, he was the first bishop of the Christian church in Jerusalem, the first bishop of Jerusalem. Peter was the first bishop of Rome. In 66 AD was the Jewish revolt against Rome. This is a commonly accepted and indisputable date. 4 years later was the destruction of the temple. In 70 AD, the temple was destroyed. And Flavius Josephus wrote The Jewish War in Rome. He was a general in the Jewish army and then switched sides, and he wrote the definitive history of the Jewish revolt, and it has survived to this day. And he wrote that sometime after 70 AD. Now, as a result of the Jewish revolt against Rome, the temple was destroyed. And a lot of the countryside and a lot of the villages were destroyed. It was a very cataclysmic event. Now, it occurred on 66 AD because of the numerology, and 66 was important, and that's related to the 666 number on the beast. And I don't know a lot more about it than that, but 66 years later, in 132 AD, was the Simon Bar Kokhba revolt, the second Jewish revolt against Rome. And this was also, the date was chosen for numerical reasons, numerology. It was the second cycle of 66 years. And after that, all of Israel, Judea, was absolutely destroyed. Every book in Israel was burned. Every tree was cut down. Jerusalem itself was laid waste, and no one lived there for almost 100 years. The destruction was absolute and total. And very little literature exists from before that time. There is very little writing from the Mideast that has survived that existed before 132 AD. So, that is our general framework of the history of the Mideast. And early Christian writings are very, very rare because any writings are very rare. Now, it's commonly assumed that the letters of Paul were written before the revolt against Rome, and this would be 40 to 60 AD. Now, there's two curious things about that. Half of the letters that Paul wrote are accepted by a lot of authorities as being forgeries. There were more than one authors, and when you do analysis, a lexicographical analysis of the text, the same way that police investigators investigate text, there were two different people that wrote the letters of Paul. And 6 or 7 of them are ascribed to a second writer. And it's not certain when they were written. But those are among the earliest written books in the Bible. And the curious thing is, Paul never met Jesus. And there is some controversy about the early days in the interpretation and the message, and we'll just leave it at that. Now, it's highly possible that the Gospel of Thomas could be the Q source, or the Gospel of Thomas also used the Q source, the sayings of Jesus. It's uncertain, but one curious fact is where parables or stories exist in the Synoptic Gospels and in the Gospel of Thomas, they're in a primitive, more primitive form with fewer elaborative words in the Gospel of Thomas. There is material, adjectives, and events added when the parables are included in the Synoptic Gospels. Now, it's understandable why the date has been pushed back to about 200 AD for the writing of the Gospel of Thomas, because then that removes all authority. Because the worldview in the Gospel of Thomas is not apocalyptic. It's not fulfilling of a prophecy. And it is much more of a mystical, what's called Gnostic now, mindset. And it's not temporal, it's not legalistic, it's not political, and it is, the message of Jesus is definitely different than the message in the Synoptic Gospels. And that's a major reason why it wasn't included. However, it was a very popular book. Jude, in the book of Jude in the New Testament, references sayings in the Gospel of Thomas. So in a way, it has snuck into the New Testament. There was a vigorous persecution of all literature by the Christian church. In all the written works of the entire history of Greece and Rome were destroyed by the Christian church. This is a fact. The only works that have survived to this day of any kind from the entire history of Greece and Rome, the entire 1200 or more year history, survived outside of the Roman Empire and outside of the reach of the Christian church. But in every community and in every nation and country where the Christian church had political power in the Middle Ages, all the works of literature except for the Bible were destroyed. It was one of the most complete destructive censors of literature in the entire history of mankind. It was not motivated by truth and honesty and openness or honor or fairness. And I'll stop right there. For 1800 years, the Gospel of Thomas and the possible transcription of sayings from Jesus' mouth did not exist. And miraculously, it was discovered an almost perfect copy and corroborated by a few fragments that were found at a Greek site, for lack of that. So, the Gospel of Thomas is a fascinating and phenomenal book, one of the most amazing books in the history of mankind. Now, let's look at the history again. Jesus died sometime around 30. Everyone that knew him knew each other. And for the next 30 or 40 years until the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, they all remembered the stories because they were there. They didn't need someone to write the story out because they all lived it. Now, it's interesting to note, before the uprising against Rome, all the early Christians left Jerusalem. So they were not involved in the uprising against Rome. Also, the Zealots all left, and the Zealots went to Masada, and the people that were killed on Masada, they killed themselves, were Zealots. And the Zealots were revolutionaries, that assassins, that only targeted their own countrymen, the fellow Jews. The Zealots did not target Romans or foreigners. Curious fact. Another curious fact, there were three main groups of Jewish philosophy at the time of Jesus. The Sadducees, which had the most traditional beliefs, very literal, the body died and went in the ground. The Pharisees, which had introduced a lot of customs from Zoroastrianism during the Persian captivity, introduced the concept of the soul, of Satan and the devil. The Pharisees introduced the concept of personal prayer, personal salvation, and a lot of the customs that seem familiar to us today that were adopted by the church. There was also a group of Essenes that were extremely religious, like monks, that lived isolated in a very prescribed, devout life in the desert, and they're not mentioned at all in the New Testament. But they were the group that authored the Dead Sea Scrolls, and during the siege of Jerusalem in 66 AD, Qumran, which was the capital, or where the Essenes lived, was destroyed. And Qumran was destroyed before Jerusalem was destroyed. And the Essenes disappeared from history. After the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem after 132 AD, the Sadducees disappeared from history. So that's the context that we find the Gospel of Thomas. And I'll leave it for you to read it yourself and see what you think. It's very short and it's really easy to read. But I'll leave you with this last thought that is very interesting. Saying 1:13. His followers said to him, "When will the kingdom come?" His followers said to him, "When will the kingdom come?" And his response is, "It will not come by watching for it." It will not be said, "Look, here it is," or "Look, there it is." Rather, the Father's kingdom is spread upon the earth, and people do not see it. The Father's kingdom is spread upon the earth, and people do not see it. Okay, the hidden sayings of Jesus, the Gospel of Thomas, a new translation, I highly recommend. Thank you, and leave your comments below.